Hello and welcome to Tipsy Tolstoy, Russian literature for the inebriated.
I'm Matt Gerasimovich, PhD student in Russian Lit. This week, instead of doing my reading on the Slavophiles, I decided it would be time better spent to instead purchase a game called Gas Station Simulator and try my luck at running my own gas station.
How'd it go?
Pretty good so far. I'm making more money than as a PhD student.
Are you interested in doing that as a real job now?
No, it seems too hard.
Sure. What if I instead send you a version of that game, but also there's a serial killer following you? Would that interest you more? Would that make you more interested in doing this in real life?
The problem is if I was being stalked at that level, I think I would want to have my own sort of true crime podcast around it.
Okay.
I really want to be able to monetize all aspects of my life.
Got it. So you'd have a true crime podcast around your own impending murder.
Yes.
Got it. You always be grinding. That's the most important lesson.
Always be. And then when I come back as a ghost, the ghost can do the next part.
Yeah. Well, be that as it may, I'm Cameron Lalana, and fun fact about my neck of the woods, one of the founders of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club recently died, and so 7,000 motorcycle members of the motorcycle club Hells Angels gathered in my neck of the woods yesterday. So it was very much advised that you do not go out at night.
Did you join them on your motorcycle? On your hog?
No,
I
decided not to because, no joke, the Hells Angels have an actual office space down the street from where I work. And sometimes if I drive there at night, I will see them all gathered there out front. And it's very tough not to hit their motorcycles because it's like right next to a roundabout. It's very thin there.
But you get a jacket probably, right? The only thing I know about motorcycle groups, gangs...
I don't mean to imply you don't know things about them, but I don't think you usually get jackets from hitting their bikes. It's usually you get something worse from that.
No. I don't think they give you a prize for hitting their bikes. I think if you were to join them, rather infiltrate from the inside.
Right. I need to learn how to ride a motorcycle first, but then after that, sure.
Okay. Well, this is a podcast where me and my good pal Cameron get to unwind from our week with some Russian literature and a drink or two. This week, we crawl towards the conclusion of Stalingrad ever so slowly with part 8 of our series. We only got 2 more after this. So
we're getting there.
It's almost done and I'm going to be sad.
You're not already sad getting into this?
No, I mean, I'm sad because of the content, but I will be sad because it's over.
Oh, yes, that's right.
As they say, don't cry because it happened. Cry because it's over.
I think that was actually the entirety of the mental health care that Soviet soldiers were given after the war. Well, before we get into the reading today, speaking of mental health care after wars are over, Matt, what are you drinking today?
All right, lads, I got a real drink today.
Oh, beautiful. I'm
very excited for this concoction that I made. It's finally getting cool outside now here in Illinois. So I have myself a warm apple cider with an apple whiskey mixed in.
That sounds really pleasant.
It is delicious. It is a dumbed down version of the sort of cider whiskey sangria concoction that we made for our friends a couple nights ago. But it still hits the
Wait,
spot.
Hold on. Were those all one drinks? That sounds, not gonna lie to you, fucked up.
No, it was delicious. It was
okay.
Sliced up pears, apples,
sure,
apple whiskey
with you so far,
apple cider, brandy, and then pomegranate seeds, and then you let it all combine for a couple hours, and then you mix in a little bit of prosecco, garnished with a cinnamon stick. Oh baby, you got yourself drunk.
That sounds like a monstrosity, but I'm not necessarily opposed to it.
I'll make it for you next time you're here on the Tipsy Tolstoy retreat.
Beautiful, thank you.
What are you drinking this fine evening, Cameron, after you called my drink a monstrosity?
Well, I am drinking. I think I'm now the one who is bringing nothing interesting to the table. I have
awesome. Finally.
I have only an Old Rasputin, which is a Russian Imperial Stout by North Coast Brewing. I think I've had it on the podcast a couple times before. It's just a good old fashioned, 8% beer. Nice thing to go back to after a long day of not buying other more interesting beers.
I mean, sometimes you got to have your tried and true.
You got to go back to some solid ones. You got to have those.
You got it.
And after 65 episodes, I'm surprised we haven't repeated more often.
Really 71 if you count bonus episodes.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, bonus episodes, we're just like, I don't know, hounding liquor for those.
True.
I don't know if they count. But anyway, before we got into the book today, I wanted to quickly, I know I kind of, for the last two episodes, I kind of fell off this. We've been talking about some book recommendations for World War II every episode. This episode, because I've fallen off 2 episodes in a row, I've decided there are no rules anymore. So I'm going to talk about a book that is about World War II, but isn't from the era, unlike almost every other book I've recommended so far, or is a history book about the era written afterwards, which is Europe Central by William T. Vollmann. Matt, I think I've talked about William Vollmann to you before. Have we? I can't recall.
Almost certainly.
Okay.
It sounds like a combination of names that you would have talked about to me.
Yes. Well, Vollmann is a supremely weird dude. He wrote a 3,000-page book on violence, which I'm like hounding to get, but all I can find is the 700-page abridged version, in which the intro to it is basically, it took me 10 years to write the original version of what was it, Falling Up, Falling Down. It took me about half an hour to make this version. I'm only making it because it costs money, but hopefully someone will read it because it's shorter now. Which, very sincere intro. William Vollmann, supremely weird writer, did a 7-book series called the 7 Cycles Trilogy, or 7 Dreams, not trilogy, 7 Dreams cycle, which is just about the interactions between the colonizing Europeans and the native peoples of the Americas through 7 different journeys, or 7 different episodes, so to speak, all written in like roughly contemporaneous language. So you're going to be like reading about the story of Pocahontas and John Smith, written by someone who's theoretically a historian of the late Middle English, or is it early modern English period. Very weird, very hard to read. Europe Central, interesting book. It is about, mostly through the lens of Dmitry Shostakovich and his life through a fictionalized lens, as well as a number of other people, artists, generals, many of them real, many of them fake, people from about 1920 to 1960, through the clash between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and later on the West and East German republics under the thumbs of different world powers. And it's just such a weirdly written section. It's not all written the same way. Sometimes the author is, like just a straightforward third person. Sometimes it's written as if it's a historical report. Sometimes it's written as if it's from the view of the secret police. Sometimes it's written as if it's a fairy tale. Every one chapter to the next. Very weird book. Incredibly satisfying, and some of the most incredible prose I think I've ever read. So not a straightforward historical perspective on the period, but just a fun one, a fun romp if you have time to read another 700 pages, I guess.
This is the one where you concluded that you now know more about a fake Dmitry Shostakovich than the real one, correct?
Oh, 3,000%. The entirety of the plot of Dmitry
Yes,
Shostakovich, if I can spoil it, is about his romance with Yelena Konstantinovskaya. And this is a real person. There's evidence that they met, but there's absolutely no evidence that they carried on a decades-long affair that was like the overriding feature of Dmitry Shostakovich's life. Completely made up. But really,
this book answers the question, what if there was evidence?
Yeah, definitely. Very much so. And again, like I said, incredible prose. One of my favorite lines in all of literature, which is, "But imagining the future, then mistaking imagination for foresight, is one of life's luxuries. Certainly it seemed to him and her, and how could it be otherwise, that whenever they kissed, they were drinking the future." Some of my favorite lines in all of literature has been written in that. Just such an incredible prose writer. And, great, probably the greatest romance that definitely never happened.
My book recommendation for this week is to read Stalingrad.
That's a great recommendation. I wholeheartedly agree with that, Matt.
I cannot in good faith assign these good people more reading than what we're already reading.
I can. I feel no qualms about that. I'm worse. That's why you're in academia and I'm working in the nonprofit industry.
I don't know. I think it should be the other way around, really. I was assigned quite a lengthy text to read over the weekend, which will not be being read.
So now let's continue on with Stalingrad Part 8, which is confusingly is Part 3 of the actual book and covers chapters 1 through 17. So this part is getting to the actual battle and is sad. It's just sad, and it doesn't immediately come off as sad, but it gets that way as we read more. I don't know if you have any additions before we get into it.
No, not really.
That's fair.
Not up front, I think.
I had a whole rant prepared about how, okay, we're 800 pages in. How is Grossman still introducing new characters before I was like, wait, I feel this is familiar. I definitely read this name. I've read this character trait before. And then as it went on, I'm like, oh, Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
This character and his family have been here this entire time in the saddest way possible.
Yeah. I think the same moment on this one. Because last time we were talking about how is he still introducing new characters, and he legitimately was. And this time it turns out we're just bad readers.
No, I knew I'd read the name before, but I was struggling to place it, and I didn't want to flip back through 700 pages to figure out where it was from, but we'll get to that in a second. So we get back, as usual, to kind of an overview of the war at this point. Now, it starts from the 25th of August, which is when the Germans are threatening from Stalingrad from the north, south, and west. And it's written that for all the stubbornness of the defenders, the Germans continued to advance. Their numerical superiority was too great. There were 3 German soldiers for every Russian soldier, 2 German guns for every Russian gun. I meant to do this before the podcast, actually look up the numbers fighting in Stalingrad, because I think commonly, at least maybe this is just because I hung around too much on non-specialist military internet before when I was too young, but the common view of the Wehrmacht USSR war is that it was a huge number of Russian forces versus a relatively small force of German soldiers. Based on my brief studies in college, that is not actually true. They were roughly similar forces. I mean, depending on the time of the war, there were greater on one side or the other, but either way, it was in the millions. I don't actually know if it's true at the Battle of Stalingrad that the Germans outnumbered the Russians, or the Soviets, I should say. But it might be. There were points in the war where the Germans vastly outnumbered the Russians. Oh, and the points in the war where the opposite was true. But it's still, if you ever heard the kind of horde idea of the Soviets fighting the Wehrmacht, that isn't borne out by the historical record. So at this point, we follow on to a month forward, and in the 5th of September, the Soviets are carrying out a very costly counterattack, which costs many troops, but it does grant them the advantage of time, and the time for the reserve troops who are coming to Stalingrad to come support them. And we join Tolya Shaposhnikov, who we have not seen in many, many hundreds of pages, who is, as a reminder, with a guards unit, with an artillery unit, and has been trained as an artillery commander. It's mentioned by the text that Tolya is now in a baptism fire, and also Pyotr Vavilov, who we started the book with, and Lieutenant Govolyov, who is at the Shaposhnikov's introductory family dinner, are also marching toward the city. We learn more about Tolya. Now we're getting more in depth with his character. He's known for his shyness in giving orders, his mathematical know-how, especially his ability to explain things to people, and his awkwardness towards women, which is exemplified by one occasion on which Shaposhnikov said to Vlasyuk, who is the commander of the regiment, "A young person from the opposite sex was asking about you at the HQ." After that, it's written, his comrades nicknamed him "young person from the opposite sex." To the rank-and-file soldiers, however, he was known as Lieutenant Could You Possibly.
This was perhaps one of the funnier lines in the whole book.
Oh, absolutely. The description of Tolya is so... it feels like from an approving uncle to, so to speak, a nephew, really, where it's kind of like, well, it could be more tough here, but really it's very fond the whole way through, even when it's kind of taking the piss out of Tolya. Mm-hmm. So as Tolya is taking command, they're slightly outside of Stalingrad, and combat's happening at every level, land and sky, every moment of the day. Pilots are fighting overhead, and the soldiers, any moment they look up, they're seeing aerial combat and are able to cheer when a MiG shoots down a Messerschmitt, or are able to cry when a Messerschmitt is, guns down a MiG and guns down the pilot ejecting from the plane. And as Tolya is marching towards the actual battle, he's having light bulb moments from his life, from his young life as a non-soldier. And all these events were compressed into a tiny compact lump. Like a hazelnut, it's written. Had any of it existed at all, the only reality now was the thunder of battle, still some distance away, but drawing nearer and growing louder. Tolya felt confused. It was not that he was afraid of death or suffering. It was more that he was afraid of the test to which he would soon be subjected. Would he pass the test? Some of his fears were childish, while others were more adult. And so he worries about whether his voice is going to crack in battle, or whether he will actually be able to stand up, or whether he's going to crack and run. So this strange mixture of someone who's never truly fought, wondering whether, will I die here? But also, am I going to look like a fool in front of, my subordinates? Simultaneously childish and adult, like the text says. But he doesn't have too much time to worry about these things because the battery commander, as they're approaching, is wounded and he's put in command. So he has to run to the front and understand the situation. And in that moment, it's noted that he basically becomes another person, similar to the last chapter in which Ivan Novikov becomes another person when he's in his element. Tolya, too, when put in command of this artillery battery, becomes an entirely another person, is able to make decisive decisions, putting the artillery much further forward because of the defensive position they're in. They will be defended as well as they could be, even if they were further back, while also providing a much better firing position. And with such confidence, explaining that even his superiors think, oh, well, that makes sense. They even begin to assume that the lines they're calling on have actually been tapped, and they're talking to German sappers. But after talking to his reasoning, realize, this really is Tolya, but assume he's gained his confidence in vodka rather than just him feeling and knowing what he should be doing. They carry on doing it throughout the day, carrying out massively successful artillery attacks until the night in which the Wehrmacht counterattacks, and they begin to pay for all their successes during the day, deeply fighting until the morning. And Tolya, in the middle of the night, it is noted, had no strength left for anything but his guns. There was room in his soul for only one feeling, only one vague dream, to survive until the morning, to see the sun. Which he does, until suddenly he's hit in the chest, and as he falls down and kind of fades out, it's noted, yelled by his men, that the lieutenant is wounded. And this is where we close the story for now.
But he was doing it till then. He really was.
He up to the point where he got shot in the chest, presumably, or otherwise doing pretty good.
He was doing pretty good.
So from this point, we join a major who's with a train of wounded people. Possibly, it gets a little vague. There's heavy-handed references to a lieutenant who's been wounded. Is this Tolya? Is it not Tolya? Uncertain, and not resolved in this section of the book. If I can be honest, at some point this is revealed to be Berezkin. I know for a fact that we've mentioned Berezkin before. I just haven't been able to find Berezkin in my notes. I think it was fairly minor presence before, but we'll expand more on how the Berezkins actually have a much larger presence in the book than it may initially seem. Berezkin has been fighting in the war since 1941, almost non-stop since the beginning, and he should have more decorations and should be much higher up, but always before he truly enters or truly receives any of these things, he always ends up disappearing and going somewhere else where he continues on as more or less a frontline fighter. In his story, traveling with these wounded, he eventually meets Aristov, who is a quartermaster and someone who used to be a subordinate of his back in the day, but is now actually much higher rank than him. But because of the features of history, Aristov kind of still sees Berezkin as a superior, and he invites him to a meal at his lodgings. So they drink and eat together, and they talk about, we learn briefly about the unwritten rules of the army, which is fascinating, especially how you address the superior.
Fascinating or highly technical? I don't know.
Okay. For me, highly technical and fascinating often overlap, so I can't say that will be the same for everyone else. I don't know if the same is true for you.
I thought, wow, this is a really long couple of paragraphs to spend talking about this in the middle of a war.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. I was thinking, man, I love understanding the cultural mores of the Red Army, but yeah, that's a fair way to look at it too. So Berezkin wants to talk about his wife during this event, but he finds that he's really unable to say anything. So Aristov talks more about really things that are very technical, why he keeps his position, how he's able to maintain these things and find things for commanders, whether it's a sturgeon or a certain type of vodka or a certain type of beer or a certain type of cigarettes. And that's how he's maintained his position. In fact, gotten quite highly in the ranks because he's able to find things that other people are not. And at this point, this is where I was like, the warning bells in my mind were going off. It's like, I know I've met this character before, in which it said that he touched the tomatoes, Berezkin does, hoping to find one that was fully ripe, but not fully soft. Then he felt embarrassment, thinking sadly how Tamara would tell him off for doing exactly that. She didn't like him fingering the tomatoes or cucumbers on a shared dish. And it was in this moment where I was like, I've read this passage before. I know I've read this very thought before. I don't know if it's in Berezkin. I don't know if it was for something that he shares with Vavilov, but this character has been here before. Be that as it may, we carry on. Aristov is called out to some duties, and Berezkin begins to drink with the landlady, who tells him about her life and the son she's lost to the war. And he is in the realm of his wife Tamara's family, where they come from, and he begins to ask her, and the woman tells him about her family history. We learn a little bit more about that. Her father, who was a commander in the army, and especially Tamara's history as kind of sort of a ne'er-do-well in a Soviet sense, I guess. So during that night, Bereskin repairs a tunic, and the landlady watches him with some amazement, noting that he's very experienced with the needle. And she asks him if he was, this is what he did in his former life. And he says, no, I've been a soldier since 1921, but he does take some pride in noting that he's always been very good with repairing and even sewing. And at one point even sewed his wife a dress, which she wore for 2 years straight and became the pride of her and the envy of all the other military wives who tried to copy it, but going to actual seamstresses and others who could create dresses. Just as a side note, for a while I was like confused when I was reading Grossman's biography. I was confused about how like multiple women left their husbands for him. But given that like most of his like true heroes or guys he writes most of Living Live are just dudes who are like just love doing chores at home, like raising their kids, spending time with their daughters. Like, man, I sure do love like sewing dresses for my wife. Yeah, I'm starting to get how Grossman really seemed to attract people.
Sure.
It suddenly makes a lot more sense to me.
The hottest trait that you can have is liking to sew dresses for your wife, according to Grossman.
I'm not an expert in these things, but I'm pretty certain that's an incredible trait if you're looking to if you're looking to attract someone. If you're going to be like, hey, look, I'm so good at household chores, I can sew dresses, I'm so good at taking care of kids. I'm saying it's a strong foot forward.
It is much like the spam bot that keeps sending us messages on our website, tipsytolstoy.com, or to our email, tipsytolstoy@gmail.com, that says, can I find here, serious man? And could they find here, serious man?
Could they? Question mark, winky face?
Question mark, winky face. I don't know. Just some food for thought.
I just got one of those the other day that like really expanded on it. Not just serious man, but serious man with many other traits they're looking for now. The inflation's really getting towards the spam bots. They're looking for a lot more now.
Really?
Yeah, I don't remember what it was, but it was a large set of traits.
That's a lot to ask.
I know. We already had serious man down.
We were starting to wrap our head around whether you could find serious man here or not. I don't know if I can add more to that.
Yeah. Well, you definitely can't find serious men here at this podcast.
Yeah, we're mostly getting targeted by like crypto scammers now. Like finance scammers.
I mean, yeah, that about scans. I mean, not crypto scammers, but finance scammers kind of scans.
Mm-hmm. So if you have a finance scam that you want us to invest in, shoot us an email at tipsytolstoy@gmail.com.
So that night, Bereskin finds the landlady crying, and it tells him that she lost all of her sons to men like him, but he's going off to the war now, and he's such a nice person. And he really doesn't know what to say to that, so he just kind of walks off. The next morning, we follow Lieutenant Derensky. Derensky, if you don't quite recall, was one of the other subordinates of Bychov, who Novikov worked with. Derensky, Bychov wanted to transfer back to the reserves, but Novikov was trying to get him forward unsuccessfully. Even when Novikov got his 10 corps later in the book, is again trying to get Derensky into his unit, but is unsuccessful at that point as well. So at this point, Derensky is moving towards Stalingrad. He's paying for less than stellar lodgings with less than stellar, amenities. Exactly, he's staying in a private home. And while he's there, he remembers his history as he's reading his novel, or not his novel, his diary, and all the things he's been through. And at the very end, it's noted that he remembered the year 1937. He remembered his time in prison, the nighttime interrogations in The Investigator. He remembered the moment in 1940 when, after being summoned from the camp to Moscow, he was told his case had been reviewed and he had been judged innocent. So Derensky is a victim of the Gulag, what would become the known as the Gulags, which is unusual. I would say, again, hard to tell what was and was not included in the actual book. I would say Derensky being gulagged, not necessarily probably included in the actual release back in the day. But this is something he did go through in his time. And he following this, fantasizes about his triumphs over Bychov, being promoted and having Bychov under him in command sense. And he acknowledges it as kind of petty, but at this point he really has nothing else to imagine rather than just, I'm going to get one over on those above me who have, treated me like I'm nothing.
Yeah, and obviously his ultimate goal to probably 30 or 40 years in the future to form the Russian variant of the English new wave band formed in Birmingham in 1978 by keyboardist Nick Rhodes and bassist John Taylor, comrade Duran Derensky. Anything? Anyone?
I'm gonna need to. I'm not gonna lie to you. I'm gonna need to Google that one after we're done recording. That was good, but very specific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's for the Duran Duran VIP fans out there.
Well, for all of it, I know there's a huge overlap between Tipsy Tolstoy fans and Duran Duran fans.
And it is funnier when you have to explain the joke. So there you go.
I find that with every joke, the more you have to explain it, the funnier it is. That's what I've always enjoyed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
People love it. I'm great at parties.
Well, speaking of parties, we follow some soldiers trying to cross a bridge who are watching some planes circling overhead, which for a brief time we go to a much wider perspective and understand these planes overhead are actually General Zhukov discussing with his subordinates the war, and also many things really not so important about the war as they go onward. Well, the soldiers blow when we rejoin them, which apparently includes Vavilov, our boy Pyotr Vavilov, as they go on discussing the strange planes who are above them, who could possibly be there, some lieutenant commander. They're imagining such low ranks compared to the actual leader of the forces at the time. So we're following many of the troops who are approaching Stalingrad. Really, at this point in this part, we are following those who are reserve troops who are entering the city or going towards the city, and it's written of them as they're approaching. Black dust swirled on the road. High in the sky hung a shimmering glow, a glow that had now hung over Stalingrad, over the Volga and the surrounding steppe for several nights. The whole world had seen this glow. It fascinated and horrified them now, moving towards it. So those soldiers moving towards Stalingrad are horrified by the basically constant combat that's happening in the sky, on the streets, anywhere around there. And so we zoom out over a wounded unit who are moving towards Stalingrad, over the refugees fleeing away from Stalingrad, and those sort of deserters, those sort of not quite fighting, not quite retreating, who are also existing around the city, which is a very one of the chapters which Grossman writes, which is strongly focused on individual stories. It's hard to say whether or not these are created or things he actually heard, although remembering that he didn't integrate many stories which he did know, could go either way on this front. Returning back to Duransky, he stays in a hut overnight, and he has a conversation with the people who live there about the dozen sons, 3 actual sons, and 9 grandsons they sent to the war, and the many other things they've given to both the war and the soldiers who've come through before the old couple flee the house for the night, going to sleep in a ravine to avoid bombings, while Duransky, who is so tired, just goes to sleep on a cot right above ground while bombers around them fly, dropping bombs in the surrounding areas. So in the morning, Duransky wakes up. Normally, at this time of dawn, this would be a time of quiet, and at least in previous times, Duransky had been fighting. But now, in this new form of war, even in these bright hours, planes are flying, soldiers are fighting, and then there is no hour of quiet. So he and Boroskin eventually meet. Boroskin is late because he's trying to go get milk for a wounded soldier they have, which Duransky finds greatly irritating, although after finding the reason, backs off him a little bit, until Duransky sees something, and in fact cries out, and then the rest of them begin to look. And this cry, it's written, was so frightening, so charged with complaint, horror, grief, reproach, and happiness that everyone who heard it flinched, as if from a burn or some other sudden physical pain. So this is Duransky suddenly realizing that he sees his wife and daughter, his wife Tamara and his daughter Luba. And it's written following this, Duransky realized that he too was shaking. This chance meeting in the steppe was something he never spoke about. But even 30 years later, when he was a lonely old man, he would feel the same overwhelming anguish as when he remembered this moment. When he remembered how this man and woman had first looked at each other, and how he had glimpsed in their faces all the savagery and grief and homeless happiness in those terrible years. So in this moment, Boroskin and his wife Tamara meet, and they see their as well as their daughter Luba. And this is the moment when it began to pull together for me, because Luba remembers the table of the Shaposhnikovs as Duransky and Tamara meet, and Duransky gives Luba and Tamara all the food he can muster, all the milk he was bringing to his wounded men, and all the quietness he can bring in a house he requisitions from a nearby family. And that was when I began to realize and remembered that there was a small girl named Luba at the Shaposhnikov's table at the very beginning of the book. And I go back and I realize Tamara, who is the wife of a Red Army commander who she's not seen since the beginning of the war, who also put her son Slava in a home at Marusia's with Marusia's help to make sure they got fed 3 times a day, and who had a daughter named Luba, began to make sense. And I thought, Slava, that name sounds familiar. And I went forward and I realized in the chapter where Marusia is checking out the children's home, she's actually checking on a boy named Slava. She's helped place there, and of course Slava will be killed after trying to comfort a small Ukrainian boy while they're crossing a river, along with Marusia and the others in that orphanage. And in this moment when they meet, Tamara also cries into Ransky, telling him that she was not able to keep Slava safe.
Labyrinth of plots.
It all comes together.
It all comes together.
In the worst way possible.
In the worst way possible.
So the Borozkins have been here this whole time, but unlike the Shaposhnikovs, they've been more prone to death. And also, Tamara, later we'll talk to Duransky about Tamara will talk to Borozkin about the great wanting they had in the time between when they were apart before they got to the Shaposhnikovs in Stalingrad. The great hunger and fleeing and having to do work just to make it by in the many months. It's a rough one. And that chapter also is written from the meeting between Tamara and Berezkin is written from the perspective of Luba, who does not understand what's going on really. And so a lot of the chapter is kind of between the lines as you get the actual literal lines of what they're saying before it's interpreted through Luba's perspective, who doesn't really understand what's going on. And it's one of the tougher chapters to read, I will say. There have been a lot of tough chapters for like a lot of reasons, but the one where you clearly understand what's going on, but you have to interpret it through the eyes of a child who doesn't. It's a rough one. It's a rough read. Yeah.
This part specifically.
Yeah, the one rough part of the book,
No other parts, but yeah, just this one.
So they spend the rest of their day together, and towards the end, there's not even really prose to speak of. It's just contextless sentences from one to the other about Slava, about their old friends who are now dead, about what they're going to do going forward, about missing each other. And it continues for a page and a half until finally it says, "In the morning, they parted. Once again, uncertain of whether or not they're ever going to see each other again." It's a rough one.
Yeah, it was a very emotional chapter in the middle of just kind of army marching.
Yeah. And so from here, speaking of army marching, we go back to the marching of Lieutenant Kovalyov, who is also a member of the Shaposhnikov's table at the beginning of the story, as well as Pyotr Vavilov, as their unit is marching towards Stalingrad, and the various things they run into, the various characters they run into. The one woman who finally makes Vavilov break from his internal stoicism, in which she's trying to sell water to the soldiers for 10 rubles apiece. He asks someone who's returning, hey, why aren't you buying the water? And he says, well, she's selling it to us at 10 rubles apiece. And when he goes up to confront her, she says, well, I need to feed my children. And he freaks out and kicks over her water bucket and says, feed this to your children, like kind of draws his gun, and she runs off. And all the other soldiers are kind of shocked because even they are for once, they're more accepting than Vavilov is, and says, is this really our Vavilov? He's so calm. How could he do such a thing, really? And that continues on to another a short vignette in which Vavilov goes to meet a peasant woman who's promised some tomatoes to their regiment. And while he's in their house with her son, and she tells him about her husband's who's been killed, which is why she's giving the tomatoes, because she's the salt to save them all through the winter. And they'll just go to waste. He stops and decides to take some extra time and takes an axe and starts fixing things around her house, which, as if you'll recall back to the beginning of the story, one of the his regrets about leaving behind his home is all the things he wanted to fix, but he wouldn't have time to, and his wife doesn't have the know-how to fix. And at some point he hears footsteps and he grows fearful and looks out and thinks he's going to see Kovalyov, and then grows ashamed that such everyday tasks, in which his own life he would think nothing of going about and doing, he now feels and knows for certain that he'll be punished if he's caught dilly-dallying, because it's not what it's being asked of him for the war effort, but is still unable to stop and just not see a door which needs fixing and think, well, it's going to be cold in the winter, so I need to fix it, and no one else is going to do, so I should. those are the stories as they approach Stalingrad, which more or less close out this part of the book. But I do want to read the final paragraph of this part as we rejoin Yermenko, who is, as a reminder, the leader of the Stalingrad front, and the way they've moved Yermenko's front from the actual city of Stalingrad to behind the Volga. And Yermenko is telling a new commander, Choikov, who we met briefly before, about going into the city and commanding troops in there, and telling him there is no longer a west and east bank to the Volga. There is only the west bank. That's the only one that matters. And they are reflecting basically on how close the combat is to them, getting within German submachine gunners, getting within 250 meters of this very HQ during the nights, or at least it was getting within 250 meters when they were in the city. And then Choikov going into the city to fight and begin to take on the, not exactly losing fight, that's not what anyone's saying at this point, but the fight in which no one, including Yermenko, is hopeful for in Stalingrad. And as Choikov leaves, it's noted that he knew very well that the city was dead. Shading his eyes with one hand, Choikov continued to look at the city. Why did these ruins seem so alive? Was it a mirage? A vision of the past? Could it even be a vision of the future? What awaited him among these ruins? How would the coming weeks and months turn out? Looking towards the east, he bellowed to his adjutant, Fyodor, the car. They could hear his bellow even below in the bunker. Dubrovkin said gravely, Dubrovkin is one of the aides in the bunker, that Fyodor must have a hard time of it. And people say adjuncts don't see real combat. And that's where we end chapter 17 of part 3 of this book, and the end of what we'll be covering in this podcast, or at least the chapter summary, which will be coming in this particular part of the podcast.
It was a part.
I think last time we kind of, not complained, but talked about how we took a sudden break from the war to go to the back lines to talk about the farmers and the people carrying out the coal mining, which is very slow. And now we're regaining the war effort, in which things happen fast. We have Tolia, who carries on a glorious mission as an artillery commander, but is within only a few pages wounded and left to an unknown fate, and we rejoin those many reservists who are marching towards Stalingrad in their interminable march towards it, which is, I think, it makes sense. The soldiers in combat, they have moments of intense combat, and suddenly they're wounded and they're back out because of the intensity of it, whereas those who are on their way just are spending many, many hours marching, finding food, finding shelter, and so on.
Well, I think what it makes you realize at this point is, like, there are some cases where the war is day and night, just constant fighting. But most of what it is like walking from place to place, especially from the perspective of an infantry soldier here. And it really does feel like that.
Well, walking and finding food, really. I mean, as you mentioned for Kerensky, he is even paying for his own lodgings on the way there. And he complains that he's paying more for these lodgings than he paid in Moscow. And says that he actually gets worse accommodations than we had in Moscow for the same money.
Yeah, it's walking and trying to get food and trying not to have your blisters become infected and die.
An age-old, trouble for marching soldiers.
Mm-hmm. Few things on this part that I liked a lot. The stylistics of Grossman here, I think, are phenomenal, and you actually pointed out a couple of the ones that I wanted to talk about. So I thank you for my segue.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
The first chapter, well, I can kind of work my way backwards a little bit since we were already here. The meeting that we have between husband and wife, the presentation of it, let's call it, really Tolstoyan in some aspects to me. So the whole, almost the entire meeting is actually told through Luba's, the younger daughter's point of view, which is a really fascinating way to show this scene. I like the way the couple lines here where the narrator, who's from Luba's perspective, says, "Then Papa began to tell his own story. He mentioned old friends, some of whom Mama remembered, and Luba noticed that Papa kept repeating the word killed, just like Mama repeated the word bread." And I thought it was just a really interesting way to conceptualize this kind of meeting between older people who kind of have this a different set of concerns than the child, and what that kind of looks like to a fresher, less weathered pair of eyes, let's say. And It reminds me a lot of the very famous Tolstoy work, Holstomer, A Story of a Horse, where Tolstoy does the narration from the point of view of a horse, and it kind of slips into that point of view very seamlessly, and the same exact thing happens here. This is not a Tolstoy specific technique. There's a lot of people that do this that are not Tolstoy or Grossman, but I do think it's kind of an intentional technique that he's sort of picking up and using for sure. And the technique itself, should anybody care, kind of is conceptualized in the 1910s. It's a technique called defamiliarization, and the formalist critic Victor Shklovsky, in his essay Art as Device, or sometimes called Art as Technique, is the one that kind of coins the term. And it's a technique that's used to sort of, make you feel estranged from what you're reading through the perspective of what it's the subject that's being presented. And so this was a super great example of that. If I ever have students that I have to teach about defamiliarization, this is a great passage to sort of use, and just to see kind of how strange the war is and the effects that it has on children specifically, who don't really have a full understanding of what it is that's happening.
Right, because even Luba even misunderstands some of Berezkin's activities or actions when she gives her some food, and she notes that while she's eating, and he watches her, and he's like, he seems angrier, and when he notes how readily she eats the fish, he begins to cry, and she feels offended, and like, why is he crying that I'm eating this fish? Of course, anyone who's, well, I would assume around her age, a little bit younger, a little bit older, much older, will understand why a father would cry upon seeing his father so rudely go after fish during wartime. She doesn't understand, so you really have to step outside of the author saying anything to your own understanding of that encounter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was just an exceptionally written passage, and it's kind of like the emotional climax, I think, of this part of the book for sure, or at least this 100 pages that we read. Right,
especially when bringing together, and I don't, this isn't technical, but bringing together so many stories of Tamara, going back and reading the Shaposhnikov's first story of dinner, and all these discrete stories of Tamara struggling and feeling embarrassed of having nothing, of Slava trying to be brave during his time at the orphanage before he was killed, and Berezkin just trying to carry on the war in every step of the way when he sees his wife's old village, and when he's marching, thinking about where's Tamara now, what's going on, and finally seeing her and bringing it all together, and finding out that his son is dead, and everything, and all the struggles they've gone through in his absence, and his struggles too in their absence. It's such an affecting scene. And so many of the other parts of the book, yeah, also affecting, but this one it's like an unexpected gut punch rather than the one that you follow, remembering that there are other families in this war too who are not, just are side characters from our perspective, but have such an internal life of their own that when they get to be, highlighted, it feels just as impacting as any of the characters we spent many, many pages with.
Yeah, and then just how simply Grossman allows them to part at the end of the chapter in terms of description. That's it. They just part. That's it.
They part. They don't know if they're ever going to see each other again, and they part. Mm-hmm. They get less than 6 words, and they parted, more or less.
Yeah, which is kind of, I think it's fine. I think in the extreme circumstances of war in general, and I think that probably this is part of his camaraderie general point, which is that just there's an unspoken understanding of what's happening, and there's an unspoken understanding of kind of what to expect.
Yeah,
everyone is essentially willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, and that's kind of the unwritten understanding. Well, most people, the people that are not, are the ones that get ridiculed. If you spend all your time looking for champagne and fish, well, you're really not doing that great of a service.
Well, as Grossman points out, to some people in the service, you're very important if you do that.
Right, right. But as the old lady points out, that's not who's winning the war, right?
Yeah.
And who do you trust more, military generals or old Russian lady?
That's a hard one. There are a couple other examples of beauty you said you want to talk about. What are the other ones?
The other one that I really liked, which is going to be on our reading list eventually for us to be able to compare, is this genre of Russian prose that emerges after World War II called lieutenant's prose. And this has to do with a lot of the young lieutenants that are kind of come up through the Red Army during World War II and are fighting. And the whole passage with Tolya is very, very reminiscent of a couple things, but the one that I want to read on the podcast is called Frontline Stalingrad by Viktor Nekrasov. And we were actually going to read it previously, but it didn't even get around to it. That's a book where it really is like second by second on the front line. This definitely jumps around a lot more, and you do get like some battle scenes, but it's mostly not really focused on the battle, I would say. Frontline Stalingrad and the Lieutenant's Prose in general is much more focused on, I'd say, sort of the psychology in battle, like during battles specifically. And I think it's a really strong part in this book, but I also think that there are books where like that is the whole thing of it. And that's also a kind of an interesting like counterpoint, but in another interesting perspective of this war and war in general.
Right. And if I can break in for a second, I think it's something that it kind of outlines one of the, I don't know if this is conscious or not, one of the kind of ideologies of Grossman. And also, you hypothesized previously that maybe Svetlana Alexeyevich has read Grossman because of his intense desire to not reduce war to just the moment-to-moment, combat between soldiers, but to tell the stories of those in the front line, on the home front, in the back line, those in the production line, which is similar to what Grossman, or to what Alexeyevich tries to do in her work. And I can't help but wonder in this part if that's something that, I mean, I won't draw this comparison out further, but it is, to your point about Lieutenant Fiction, it's like an Alexeyevich version of Lieutenant Fiction, where, yeah, it does have the glory of combat, where they get to revel in their success against the German lines, hitting German fuel lines before, but in the, within a day, Tolya is wounded. And to be frank, for most soldiers in the Red Army, that not, one day of combat isn't necessarily normal, but, not a whole lot of time on the front line without being shot would be a little surprising. And so this is like a lieutenant's prose, but within the constraints of lieutenant's prose, but yeah, everyone kind of gets shot pretty fast if you're on the front line.
Yeah, it kind of, I think it is still very Grossman-esque, though, in a lot of ways.
Right.
Because he's less looking at he is looking at the psychology of the individual, but he's looking at how they change within specific circumstances, because he has this really wonderful passage, which I think is kind of the encapsulation of what he thinks it's like in the military and how people change when Tolya is really kind of starting to, they're starting to do well, and he's very much more confident, and he's like essentially a different person. But he says, Lieutenant Shapashnikov was indeed still himself. To think that someone has suddenly been transformed is always a mistake. No one who really knows another person will ever say in bewilderment, I can't believe it, he's changed overnight. It's much more accurate to say, circumstances have suddenly changed, and this has allowed what was always present within him to reveal itself. Which is a funny, to me it sounds funny because it's a much more technical thing to say. Nobody, of course, would ever say that. But it definitely is, I think, what Grossman is getting at. All of these people who are very ordinary, it's not that they suddenly change and become extraordinary, it's that was always actually in them, and these circumstances have allowed them to become extraordinary, or to reveal the extraordinary within them.
If you want to tie back to our long running theory of the ordinary dash ordinary, the ordinary dash heroic, which is that in this case, the ordinary dash heroic within people is not a sudden thing that's introduced by the concept of warfare, but the ordinary dash heroic is something that's always within a person, and the presence of something like a trying factor like warfare may allow that ordinary dash heroic to suddenly take front and center.
Mm-hmm. And I like I said, I think this is a much more realistic model of socialist realism, rather than there is no off time. You are always doing something incredibly heroic, which is, of course, not really realistic.
Right.
Whereas here you have just what are generally what people would consider very average people who do happen to do something very extraordinary.
I think it's also, I also really like the perspective of many varied like people just in villages on the way, especially for the many marching troopers, for Derensky, for Vavilov, who have different perspectives in the war. Like Derensky's landlady who's sort of conflicted because she kind of seems to want to hate Durensky for kind of soldiers like him taking her sons away from her, but also understanding that he's such like a nice person, understanding what he faces and what he's doing. Well, there are others who are like, well, you're a lieutenant, I'm here, you sleep here, I'm gonna go sleep in the trenches, not in a good or a bad way, but just like neutral, versus those encountered by Vavilov, where they're very, I don't want to say servile, but like the ones who are like very kind of pro Red Army, who Vavilov feels is in kinship to himself, but Vavilov in those moments in kinship with those people feels distanced or alienated from the Red Army life. I think it's a good perspective for just those along the way. Those not villages not far away from the war and not in the war, but those villages in those kind of liminal zones between what could be frontline soon but are not now. Just a good character study of life, I guess.
One of the last points that I'm kind of interested in, as we've been kind of talking about, is the Soviet conceptualization of empire, and whether good or bad or problematic or what to kind of make of it. There's just this kind of long list of towns that's mentioned on 753 in the beginning of chapter 11. It's just kind of reminiscing about different towns and the good parts of them, like the parks and the squares and the seaside. And, well, like probably half of the towns that are mentioned are not in Russia.
Right. Mostly in Ukraine.
Yeah, they're in Ukraine, and they're spelled with the Russian spelling of the word. And I just thought it was interesting, the sort of linguistics of empire that come to the forefront of that. Even through translation, it kind of comes through. And the more I kind of think about it, there are several people that are kind of in the military. And this one, I don't know if it's clear necessarily who's speaking at this point, but in the very beginning of part 3, there's a conversation between two soldiers going on where he's talking about how he, in 1941, had been fighting in the forests of Belarus and Ukraine. And he says, I've seen things that cannot be spoken about, that no one will ever write down. And it's just, again, just so clear how really kind of the brunt of the atrocities that even in the book, the soldiers are like, yeah, we won't talk about this. This was terrible. Really are not necessarily happening on Russian soil. And the fact that they kind of get lumped in as a sort of kind of like shared suffering, I'm not sure is really felt by everybody in the novel. You know what I mean?
Right.
I still think there's a sense of othering that happens when characters talk about Ukraine and other Soviet republics specifically, that is kind of not, it's kind of, I'd say, like playfully neglected when it comes onto the Soviet rah-rah, we beat the Germans sort of rhetoric.
Because I think, again, this is something that I don't think was maybe reflected in the actual version that was published in the USSR, but early in the book, when I think it's Krymov is in Ukraine, there's a lot of Ukrainian citizens or peasants who kind of express an ambivalence about the Germans of like, well, will it be so bad? We've seen what's come. What's happened? We'll see what is to come. And of course, that's a result of the fact of the actual Golodomor, in which millions of Ukrainians died as a result of the the collectivization policies of the USSR, and also it combined with the fact that the USSR post treaty with Nazi Germany kind of suppressed sort of their racial attitudes towards Slavs. It's easy to see how they came to that conclusion, but that's a very impactful scene. But then there are also Ukrainian characters later in the book. I forget their names in this particular section where they interact with many others, especially in Vavilov's unit, where that's not as the fact that the Ukraine is mentioned, but it's not felt as deeply as earlier in the book, where you have some depictions of Krymov and, for example, Ukrainian villages. To your point. About the language of empire and the way that it's expressed, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes very not explicitly, very softly, I guess.
Say it's not the primary focus of this read for me, because this read is just kind of an enjoyment first read for me.
Sure, yeah.
But it's something that I'm definitely paying attention to. It's not something that I have a fully worked out theory, right, or a concrete list of examples. But every time the further I read, the more examples I kind of have like piling up where I'm like, interesting.
No, but it is a good point to notice because, for example, Grossman himself mostly grew up in what is modern day Ukraine, so he's obviously familiar with these regions, and I think that's part of the reason why he notes so many of them, because he grew up in what is now in Kiev, or what has always been Kiev. That's where he was educated. That's where he grew up. But he was also educated in the center of the USSR, Moscow, which is also where Grossman went for schooling in his tertiary schooling in his university years is where he went. It has a large presence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
And two, I mean, I think you can even, this is a side point, but this is something I've been thinking about for the last couple of weeks, actually, as recently my girlfriend was reading a cookbook I have for like traditional Russian food. And, she was surprised to find that potatoes or like tomatoes aren't present in traditional Russian food, when she's like so familiar from the podcast of like, pickled tomatoes or potatoes having such a presence in food, that it was kind of a surprise to find out that potatoes are an introduction of Catherine the Great, and tomatoes are also kind of around that period. And just to talk about food, especially tomatoes and potatoes, which are of course originated from the Americas and the indigenous peoples here, being such an integral part of so many cuisines abroad. I mean, it's hard to think about Russian cuisine without tomatoes or without potatoes. And it's hard to think about Italian or Indian or a Chinese cuisine without, tomatoes, chilies, other things. So many cuisines around the world who have integrated North and South American cuisines and the products of their historical agriculture so much to the point that it almost seems natural that you get ramen, Japanese ramen, and it has corn in it without any acknowledgement, or not that it has to at a restaurant, but without necessarily you understanding that corn is not native to Japan in any facet and did not come to Japan until relatively recently. And that's true also of the story in Stalingrad, which is totally off base of what we're talking about here. But I was thinking about a lot recently about the way food makes its way around the world and the way that we often don't think about how the legacies of violent colonialism leads to the ways that we eat now, like the ever-presentness of tomatoes in Russian or Slavic cuisine, which is of course not a natural thing and not a very old thing, all things considered.
But that'll be a topic for our spin-off podcast on food.
I would love to do that. That'd be great. We'll come to that one day.
We should do hear me out. This is kind of like a new idea for a show. We should do a show where we go to different places and try food from there. Oh,
that'd be totally unique.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Almost like a travel eating show?
Sure, yeah. We could call it I don't know, bizarre cuisine? Strange foods? You think? Yeah.
I like it. I like where you're going.
I think it'd be really unique.
It really would be.
I'm not against it.
That's all I got on this part of Stalingrad.
Me too. I was really petting it out with that bit about food, which is just a minor obsession of mine, regardless of Slavic literature.
Mm-hmm. I understand.
Yes. Well, that being said, Matt, I got to ask you as we kind of close down the podcast, what are we reading next time?
Oh, boy. Next time, the journey continues. Next part of Stalingrad. Part 9. Second to last. It's going to be good. I'm looking forward to rounding out the series and being able to conclude some thoughts. I feel like for me, it is becoming time to end my journey with Stalingrad.
Sure, right. It's been here for a while.
Not that I don't love it. I'm just so curious how it's going to end, really.
Well, yeah, with that in mind, what on your ranking from 0 to Yeltsin, how drunk are you? I'm
like a 4. So what I didn't realize is that the whiskey that I was drinking, it's more like a wine sort of percentage alcohol wise.
Right.
So it didn't help. Didn't do me any favors, I will say.
Got it.
It was delicious.
Which is the important part.
Which is the important part. Yeah, I'm happy with that. So it's okay. It's okay to just be a 4 this evening.
That it is.
It's okay to be a 4 in life, but it's also okay to be a 4 on the Yeltsin scale.
That's what I keep telling my boss every day. It's just okay to be 4 at the office.
How about you? Where'd you end up?
Well, I've got these 8% beers. I think I've had about 4 of them before we started recording, and I've had 2 of them since. So
Good God.
I think I'm an 8. I think I'm a good 8 right now.
Okay.
You probably can tell by the way.
Yeah, I was wondering how you were tying in the food there for a second. It didn't help that my Wi-Fi cut out for part of it, but,
No, the food was just me getting very drunk when I was reading about tomatoes in the book and thinking dude, tomatoes are not originally from Eastern Europe, believe it or not. And then remembering trying to explain it to my girlfriend a couple days ago when I was also blitzed, but trying to fold laundry. So she was reading a cookbook. So it pulled it all back together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And now it's recorded forever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now it's recorded for posterity.
Mm-hmm. Well,
sure feel great about this version of events that I've laid out. Well, blitzed. Anyway,
before we let you go, we want to extend a sincere thank you to all of our current patrons. We've got Jeff, Madeline, Ann, Janice, Daniel, Darren, Daniel, Jack, Paige, Jesse, Lou, Irini, Brandon, Allison, Cole, Elise, Mysterious, Enardu, Joanne, Yitza, Alex, Stephanie, Julie, Eli, Caitlin, Brett, Isaac, Austin, Zachary, Pack Rob, Maya, Amanda, Blake, Shannon, Jay, Elizabeth, and Jacob. Podcasting is not free. Now that we pay for editing, it's even less free. In grad school, it doesn't pay very well. Sorry, I had to censor what I was going to say because I know the editor's going to hear this. Grad school still doesn't pay very well. So, if you're looking to join with our current patrons to keep the show running and help us cover some costs, we would be so appreciative. Take a look at our Patreon at patreon.com/tipsytolstoy if you want to become one of the Tolstoy boys. You like that?
As you like it. That's a good. I like that. Like the little keep us on our feet.
Little flair for you.
Move like a butterfly, sting like a bee.
Mm-hmm.
The music used in this episode was Soviet March by Toasted Tomatoes. You can find more of their stuff on toastedtomatoes.bandcamp.com and also on YouTube under the same username. If you're looking for other places to find us, you can also follow us on Instagram at Tipsy Tolstoy Podcast or on Twitter at Tipsy Tolstoy. You can also join our email list on our website, tipsytolstoy.com.
You'll hear from us again soon.